You are standing in the produce section under fluorescent lights, and there are 40 watermelons in a cardboard bin in front of you, and you have no idea which one to pick. So you do what everyone does. You pick one up. You thump it with 2 fingers the way your father showed you or the way you saw someone do it once on television. It makes a sound. You have no idea what that sound means. You decide it sounds hollow enough. You pay $8 for it. You drive it home. And 3 hours later, you cut it open at a family cookout in front of everyone, and it's pale pink in the middle, mealy at the rind, barely sweet at all. Somebody says, "Oh well, you win some, you lose some," and everyone eats the good parts and leaves the rest, and you go back to the store next week and do the exact same guessing all over again. I want to end that for you today, not with a trick, with the actual signs a watermelon gives you before you ever cut it open. Signs that have nothing to do with thumping, nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with reading what the plant itself already told you while it was still growing. And once you understand why these signs work, I'm going to show you the same underlying logic applied to cantaloupe, tomatoes, corn, peaches, and a few others, because it is the same handful of principles wearing different clothes every time. My name is Silas Fisher. I farm 40 acres in Holmes County, Ohio, with my wife, Ruth. Between the garden that feeds the root cellar I showed you a couple videos back and the produce stand we run at the end of our lane every summer, I have picked and sold thousands of melons over the years, and I have made every mistake there is to make while I was learning it. My own grandfather taught me the 2 signs that actually matter, and I am going to teach them to you the same way, plus the ones he never needed to know because he grew everything himself and never had to guess at a grocery store. By the end of this video, you will never thump a watermelon out of superstition again. You will know exactly where to look, in what order, and why each sign is telling you something real about sugar, ripeness, and the day that melon actually came off the vine. Let's start with the myth, because you have to clear that out of the way before anything else makes sense. Part 1. The thump and why it isn't the answer you think it is. I want to be fair to the thump test before I tell you its limits, because it isn't nonsense. When you thump a watermelon, you are listening to how the flesh and the water inside vibrate and dampen the sound. An underripe melon, which is denser and has less developed water content in its cell structure, tends to produce a higher, tighter sound. An overripe melon, where the internal structure has started to break down, tends to sound dull and flat, almost muffled. A melon at good ripeness often does produce something in between that people describe as hollow or deep. Here's the problem. That range, too tight, just right, too dull, is genuinely hard to judge reliably unless you've thumped hundreds of melons and trained your ear against melons you already know the inside of. Agricultural extension offices that study this and the produce buyers who do this for a living will tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you. The sound test is real, but it is the least reliable of the signs available to you, and it should never be the only one you rely on. It's a tiebreaker, not a verdict. I also want to clear up a myth while we're here because I still hear it constantly. The idea that round watermelons are male and oblong watermelons are female, and that one is sweeter than the other. Watermelon plants don't work that way. A single vine produces both male and female flowers, and the shape of the fruit that develops has to do with the variety and growing conditions, not the sex of a flower. And it tells you nothing reliable about sweetness. I'm not going to spend more time on it than that. It's simply not true, and you can let it go. So if the thump is unreliable and the shape myth is false, what's actually left? 2 things. 2 real, physical, visible signs that tell you almost everything, and a handful of supporting signs that back them up. Let's go through them in the order I'd check them myself, standing at a bin of melons. Part 2. The 2 signs that actually matter. Sign 1, the field spot. Every watermelon that grows on the ground develops a spot on its underside. The one patch of skin that was pressed against the soil the entire time it was ripening, blocked from direct sunlight. Farmers call it the field spot or the ground spot. This is, without question, the single most reliable visual sign of ripeness available to you, and it costs nothing to check. You just have to turn the melon over. Here's what you're looking for. A ripe watermelon's field spot will be a creamy, buttery yellow, sometimes described as the color of turned butter or light straw. A watermelon that was picked too early will have a field spot that's white or pale green or barely developed at all, because it simply didn't spend enough time on the vine for that spot to mature into its proper color. The transformation from white to pale yellow to deep buttery yellow happens gradually as the fruit ripens, which means the color of that spot is a direct, honest record of how long that melon actually sat in the field developing sugar. I'll tell you plainly, if I could only check one thing, it would be this one. Turn the melon over. Look at the spot. White or pale green, put it back. Deep, creamy yellow, that's a strong candidate. Sign 2, the tendril. Close to where the stem attaches to the melon, watermelon vines grow small, curly tendrils. The same kind of curling green threads you'd see on a pea plant or a cucumber vine, reaching out to grab onto something for support. There's usually one tendril growing close to the stem of each individual melon, and it turns out that particular tendril is one of the most honest indicators on the entire plant. While the melon is actively ripening, that tendril stays green. As the melon finishes ripening and is ready to be picked, the tendril dries out and turns brown, then eventually withers completely. A green, healthy-looking tendril right next to the stem means that melon was picked before it was fully ready. Sometimes it will still ripen a little further after picking, but it will never develop the full sugar content it would have if it had stayed on the vine. A brown, dry, withered tendril means the plant itself signaled that this melon was done. Now here's the honest complication, and I want to give it to you straight rather than oversimplify. By the time a watermelon reaches a grocery store, it has often been handled, boxed, and transported in a way that the tendril has broken off or dried out from time and travel rather than from natural ripening. So at a store, this sign is less useful than it is if you're buying directly from a farm stand or picking your own. At a farm stand or in your own garden, the tendril is close to foolproof. At a grocery store, lean much more heavily on the field spot and treat the tendril as a bonus confirmation when it's still there and readable. Once you've checked those two, here are 3 more that add confidence, none of them as strong on their own, but each one worth a glance. Wait for size. Pick up 2 watermelons that look roughly the same size. The heavier one has more water content, which generally correlates with better ripeness and a fuller flesh. This isn't a precise science, but between 2 similar-looking melons, heavier is the better bet. Skin finish. A ripe watermelon typically has a dull, matte skin rather than a glossy, shiny one. A shiny, waxy-looking skin often means the melon is still underripe. This is a softer signal than the field spot, but it's a real one, and it's quick to check with a glance. Webbing, or sugar spots. You'll sometimes see brown, rough, web-like lines or small clusters of brown dots on the skin of a watermelon. These come from bees making repeated contact with the flower during pollination, and more pollinator visits generally means more successful fertilization of the fruit, which tends to correlate with better sugar development. Heavy webbing is a good sign. No webbing at all doesn't necessarily mean a bad melon, but webbing when you see it is a point in that melon's favor. Put those 5 together. Field spot first, tendril second if you can check it, then weight, skin finish, and webbing as supporting evidence, and you will pick a good watermelon far more consistently than anyone standing next to you thumping and guessing. Part 3. Cantaloupe and why the signs are almost opposite. Cantaloupe ripens differently than watermelon, and the signs you check are almost entirely different, which is exactly why I wanted to cover it right after watermelon. So you can see clearly that this isn't one trick, it's a way of thinking that changes based on how each specific fruit actually grows and ripens. Smell first. Turn the cantaloupe over and smell the blossom end, the end opposite the stem. A ripe cantaloupe has a noticeably sweet, musky fragrance right at that spot. If you can't smell anything, it's likely underripe. This is, for cantaloupe, roughly as reliable as the field spot is for watermelon. It's the first thing I check. The stem scar. This is the cantaloupe equivalent of the watermelon tendril, and it might be the single best sign of all if you can find it. A cantaloupe that was allowed to ripen fully on the vine will actually detach from the stem on its own when it's ready. Farmers and produce handlers call this full slip. What that leaves behind is a smooth, slightly indented scar where the stem was, almost like a shallow belly button with no rough or torn fibers around it. If instead you see a rough stub of stem still attached or a torn, jagged scar, that melon was cut or pulled off the vine before it was ready, and it will not develop the same sweetness sitting on your counter that it would have developed on the plant. The netting and background color. Cantaloupe skin has a raised, rough, web-like netting pattern, and underneath that netting is a background color that should be visible between the webbing. On a ripe cantaloupe, that background color is a warm gold or tan. On an underripe one, you'll still see green showing through. The netting itself should feel thick and corky, well raised off the surface, not thin or flat. A gentle press at the blossom end, the same end you smelled. Press it gently with your thumb. It should give slightly, the way a ripe peach does. Rock hard means it needs more time. This is a supporting sign, not a primary one, since a bit of softness can also mean it's aging past its peak, so use it alongside the smell and the stem scar, not by itself. Notice what happened there. Watermelon. Check the underside, check the tendril. Cantaloupe. Smell it, check the stem. Different fruit, different exact signs, but the same underlying idea both times. Look for the honest physical evidence of how that fruit actually finished its life on the vine, rather than relying on a single folk test that only sometimes works. Part 4. Why nobody taught you this. I want to be honest about why this knowledge isn't common anymore. The same way I was honest about it with the root cellar and with passive cooling. It isn't a conspiracy. Nobody hid this from you on purpose. It's simpler and more mundane than that, and it comes down to how produce actually gets from a field to a grocery store today. Modern produce supply chains are built around one central problem that has nothing to do with flavor: getting fruit from a farm, often hundreds or thousands of miles away, to a shelf without it spoiling or bruising along the way. A fully vine-ripened watermelon or cantaloupe is more fragile, softer, and shorter-lived than one picked slightly before its peak. So a great deal of commercial produce is picked earlier than it would be if the only goal were flavor, specifically because early picked fruit survives shipping and handling better. This is documented, well-understood agricultural logistics, not a hidden scandal. Produce buyers and shippers will tell you this openly if you ask them. The result is that most people's entire experience with watermelon and cantaloupe has been fruit that was optimized for durability first and ripeness second, and the folk knowledge about how to pick the best one out of an already compromised batch simply had less value to pass down, because even a perfectly selected melon from that batch is still working with a lower ceiling than one that ripened fully in the field. Combine that with the fact that fewer families garden or buy directly from farm stands than did 50 years ago, and you get exactly what you'd expect: 2 or 3 generations, and a skill that used to be common knowledge on any farm becomes something almost nobody actively teaches anymore. When you're growing it yourself, or buying straight from the farm down the road, the fruit in front of you has usually had the chance to actually finish ripening the way it's supposed to, so learning to read it correctly matters. Part 5. The same principles applied everywhere else. Once you understand that ripeness leaves honest physical evidence, a color change, a texture change, a scent, a scar, a give under gentle pressure, you can apply that same thinking to almost anything in the produce section. Let me walk through a few more quickly, because the specific signs matter and I don't want to wave my hands at this part. Tomatoes. Color is the obvious one, but the sign most people miss is the smell right at the stem. A ripe, flavorful tomato has a distinct earthy, slightly sweet aroma right where the stem meets the fruit. A tomato with no smell there is often one that was picked green and ripened later off the vine using ethylene gas, the same compound I explained a couple videos back in the context of storing apples. That process turns a tomato red, but it does not fully replicate the sugar development that happens on the vine, which is exactly why a supermarket tomato in January so often looks perfect and tastes like almost nothing. Beyond the smell, look for a tomato that gives slightly to gentle pressure, not mushy, just a little yield, and a deep, even color for whatever variety it is. Corn. Check the silk at the top of the ear. It should be dry, slightly sticky to the touch, and brown or dark, not bright green and moist, which means it's not ready yet. You can also gently feel the ear through the husk for plump, evenly filled kernels along the whole length without peeling it back, which matters more than people think, because every ear you peel back and reject is an ear the store now has to throw away. Peaches and other stone fruit. Smell at the stem end first. Ripe stone fruit is fragrant even through the skin. Then look at the background color, not the red blush, which can appear even on underripe fruit depending on variety and sun exposure. The color underneath the blush toward the stem should be gold or cream, not green. A gentle press along the seam should give slightly. Pineapple. This one gets more folklore than almost anything else in the produce aisle. The idea that you pull a leaf from the crown, and if it comes out easily, it's ripe. That test is genuinely unreliable. A leaf can pull free on an underripe pineapple just as often as a ripe one, and produce researchers have pushed back on it for years. What actually works? Smell the base. A ripe pineapple smells sweet right at the bottom. And press gently on the fruit itself, which should give slightly rather than feeling rock solid. Color matters less than people assume too, since some of the best-tasting varieties stay mostly green, even fully ripe. Same handful of questions every single time. What does the color tell you? What does the smell tell you? What does the scar or the stem tell you? Does it give slightly under gentle pressure? Learn to ask those 4 questions of any piece of produce in front of you, and you will make far fewer disappointing cuts at the kitchen counter. Part 6. What ripening actually is, briefly. I don't want to leave this at here are signs without telling you what's actually happening inside the fruit, because understanding it makes the signs make sense instead of just being a checklist you memorized. As a fruit ripens, starches convert into sugars, cell walls begin to soften, and in many fruits, a natural plant hormone called ethylene triggers and accelerates that whole process. Fruits that continue ripening reasonably well after picking, bananas, tomatoes, peaches, pears, are called climacteric fruits because they keep producing ethylene and continuing the ripening process even off the plant. Fruits like watermelon, cantaloupe, and most citrus are non-climacteric, meaning once they're picked, they do not continue developing sugar the way climacteric fruit does. They might soften a bit, but the sweetness they had at the moment they were picked is essentially the sweetness they're going to have. That is exactly why the timing of the pick matters so much more for a watermelon than it does for, say, a banana. And it's exactly why all of those field spot and tendril and stem scar signs exist. They are the plant's own record of whether it was allowed to finish that one-time sugar development before it was separated from the vine. Here's how I'd actually use all of this the next time you're standing in front of a bin of melons or a table of tomatoes. For watermelon, flip it over, check the field spot first. If it's a deep, creamy yellow, that's your strongest candidate. Check the tendril if it's still attached and readable. Confirm with weight, skin finish, and webbing if you want extra confidence. For cantaloupe, smell the blossom end first. Look for a smooth, slightly indented stem scar rather than a rough stub. Check the background color between the netting. For everything else, ask the same 4 questions. What does the color say? What does the smell say? What does the scar or stem say? And does it give slightly under gentle pressure? None of this requires any equipment, any cost, or any special access. It requires slowing down for 15 extra seconds per piece of fruit, which is a trade almost anyone would take once they know what they're actually looking for. The next time you're buying watermelon or cantaloupe, try this the real way, instead of thumping and hoping. Flip it over. Check the spot. Check the tendril if you can. Tell me in the comments how it turns out, and tell me which of these signs you'd never heard before. I'm always curious which ones are genuinely new to people and which ones you'd half heard but never understood the reason behind. Next time, I'm going to show you how we prune our tomato plants here on the farm. The difference between a plant that puts its energy into a handful of large, sweet tomatoes and one that scatters it across dozens of small, watery ones, and exactly where to make the cut.